October the 9th, 1963, 10:39 p.m. Longarone, northern Italy. It is raining, not alarmingly, just a steady autumn rain that fills the Piave Valley on nights like this. Kind of rain that makes sleep easier. In the town below the Vajont Dam, 1,900 people are in their beds. Farmers, school teachers, children, a community that has lived in this narrow valley for generations. Beneath the reservoir that the engineers who built it called the safest dam in the world. The Vajont Dam stands 860 feet tall. At the time of its completion, the second tallest dam on Earth, it is a monument to post-war Italian ambition, a structure so technically accomplished that its designers believed it had solved every problem the mountain could present. The Italian government had said so. The engineers had said so. The people of Longarone had been given every reason to believe it. On the slopes above the reservoir, 260 million cubic meters of rock and earth are moving. The ground was moving, and new cracks were appearing, very deep and very large. They had been moving for months, slowly, measurably, in ways that instruments had recorded and geologists had flagged. No one had stopped the water rising. At 10:39 p.m. the mountain lets go. In 45 seconds, the wave that crosses the dam crest and descends on Longarone kills nearly 2,000 people. When rescue teams reach the valley at dawn, they find something that stops them. The dam is standing, no cracks, no breach. The most sophisticated concrete structure in the Alps is completely intact. The dam didn't fail. So what killed 2,000 people? To understand what happened in Longarone, you have to go back to 1957, and to a decision that was made before a single cubic meter of concrete was poured. The Vajont Gorge, carved by centuries of river erosion through the Dolomite Mountains, seemed like an ideal location. The steep, narrow walls meant engineers could build the world's tallest dam using minimal materials. The project was part of a vast hydroelectric network, designed to power Italy's post-war economic recovery, funded in part by Marshall Plan loans. There was money, there was political will, and there was the narrow gorge waiting to be dammed. Construction began. The dam itself was an extraordinary piece of engineering, a double-curved thin-arch structure, 860 feet tall, that used the geometry of the gorge to carry enormous loads with relatively little concrete. When it was completed in 1960, it was the second tallest dam on Earth. The engineers were proud of it. They had reason to be, but the gorge had a history they had not fully reckoned with. The people who had lived in the Piave Valley for generations had a name for Mount Toc, the 6,000-foot peak that formed the southern wall of the reservoir. They called it La Montagna che Cammina, the mountain that walks. Not folklore, a warning, passed down through generations of farmers and shepherds who had watched those slopes shift with their own eyes. Trees that tilted without wind, ground that cracked for no reason, terrain that moved when solid ground is not supposed to move. The engineers had their own warnings. 3 separate geological surveys, conducted before and during construction, had identified the southern flank of Mount Toc as dangerously unstable. One survey warned in plain language that rising reservoir water could trigger a catastrophic slope failure. These were not casual observations. These were formal engineering reports, written by qualified professionals. They were received, filed, and the project continued. The reason was the same reason dangerous decisions have always been made. The dam was already built. The power grid needed electricity, and the people who would be killed if something went wrong lived in Longarone, not in Rome. The reservoir began filling in February 1960. Almost immediately, the mountain answered. A crack opened on the southern face of Mount Toc, not a hairline fracture, but a fissure nearly 1.5 miles long, tracing the exact boundary of an ancient landslide scar. The mountain had collapsed before, thousands of years ago, so long ago that the debris had become part of the landscape. The very narrowing of the gorge that made it seem ideal for a dam existed because the slope had failed there once already. The engineers had built their reservoir inside a natural trap. Beneath that slope lay a specific and lethal geology, layers of porous limestone separated by thin seams of clay. As reservoir water rose, it seeped through the limestone into those clay layers. Clay, when saturated, loses its grip. The friction that had held 260 million cubic meters of rock in place for centuries was quietly failing. The engineers believed they had found a solution. Raise the reservoir level. The slope moved faster. Lower it. Movement slowed. They told themselves this was control. It was not control. It was a pattern, and the pattern was concealing something they could not afford to see. Each cycle of filling and draining left those clay layers marginally weaker than before. The mountain was being taught to move. For 3 years, between 1960 and 1963, engineers managed the reservoir like a dial, and told no one in Longarone what the instruments were reading. The 1,900 people living below a dam that engineers were actively monitoring for catastrophic failure did not know that monitoring was taking place. Not a single public notice, not a single word. By October 1963, the dial had stopped working. Exceptional autumn rainfall was soaking into the slope from above while the reservoir pressed against it from below. The slope was now moving at 80 centimeters per day, nearly 3 feet, and accelerating. Partial warnings were issued in nearby villages. Road access below the dam was restricted. The reservoir was drawn down further. Officials believed what was coming would be large, but survivable. What they had not calculated was 260 million cubic meters, moving as a single unified mass. Nothing like it had occurred anywhere in the modern world. There was no model for it. There was no reference point. In Longarone, there was no evacuation order. A report filed in July 1962, 14 months before that night, had predicted in writing that a major landslide would overtop the dam and destroy the villages downstream. It named Longarone. It described, with reasonable accuracy, exactly what would happen. It was received, read, and set aside. At 10:39 p.m. on October 9, 1963, the entire southern flank of Mount Tok let go. 260 million cubic meters of rock struck the reservoir in under 45 seconds, moving at nearly 70 miles per hour. The impact displaced the water instantaneously. The wave that rose on the opposite shore reached 860 feet above the reservoir surface. The wave that turned west overtopped the dam by 800 feet, a wall of water taller than the Eiffel Tower, and entered the Vajont Gorge. Longarone was 4 minutes away. The town was asleep. Of the estimated 1,328 people in Longarone that night, 1,269 were killed. 94%. The railway station was not damaged. It was gone. Surrounding villages were erased so completely that rescue teams could not determine where buildings had stood. Local authorities had ordered 500 coffins. Standing at the edge of what had been Longarone, they understood within minutes that 500 was not a number that applied to what they were looking at. The accepted death toll is between 2,000 and 2,500. The range exists because entire families were erased. There was no one left to report them missing, no one to say their names. The dam was standing, perfectly intact, not one crack. The structure performed exactly as its engineers had designed it to perform. It simply had nothing to do with what happened. In 1969, 6 years after the disaster, 3 men were convicted of negligence and manslaughter. President of the construction company, the chairman of the Regional Public Works Council, the lead engineer, each received a 6-year sentence for the deaths of between 2,000 and 2,500 people. Each served less than 3 years. Vajont changed dam engineering worldwide. Slope stability analysis became mandatory. Geological surveys were strengthened. The principle that communities living below large dams have a right to know about risks to their safety became, in many countries, law. The Vajont Dam still stands. There is no water behind it. Engineers travel from around the world to stand on its crest, look down at the rebuilt town below, and try to understand how the men responsible could have known what they knew and done what they did. The 1962 report described the wave in the villages. It was filed 14 months before the disaster and never acted upon. Between 2,000 and 2,500 people died on a rainy Tuesday night in October because a document that predicted their deaths was received, read, and set aside. That is not a story about the power of nature. That is a story about what happens when the people responsible for public safety decide that the cost of stopping is higher than the cost of continuing, and that the people living below the dam are not their problem to solve. The mountain that walks has not moved significantly since 1963. The scar on its face is still visible from the road, the shape of the absence left by 260 million cubic meters of rock. Local people know what they are looking at. They have always known.